Either they didn't notice, which means they weren't paying attention, or they did notice and chose not to act, which is worse. The conversation that followed had been one of many similar discussions taking place throughout the castle, as students grappled with the implications of Harry's revelations for their own relationships with adult authority figures. Even more significantly, the story had prompted other students to examine their own experiences with fresh eyes. Dean Thomas had quietly approached Professor McGonagall about concerns regarding his stepfather's treatment of him during holidays. Susan Bones had written to her aunt about strange gaps in her memories following visits with certain family members. Seamus Finnegan had begun asking questions about why his mother's magical accidents always seemed to coincide with periods when she was particularly upset about his father's behavior. The domino effect extended beyond Hogwarts itself. Parents throughout magical Britain were receiving letters from children who had previously accepted problematic situations as normal, now equipped with vocabulary for recognizing and discussing different forms of abuse or manipulation. Professor Snape had requested a private meeting with Harry 2 weeks after the formal inquiry into Dumbledore's conduct had been announced, arriving at Remus's office with an expression that managed to convey both profound discomfort and grudging respect. "Potter," Snape said without preamble, his usual sneer notably absent. "I owe you an apology." Harry blinked in surprise. "Sir? I was aware that your home situation was suboptimal," Snape continued, his voice carefully controlled. "I observed behavioral patterns consistent with neglect, possibly abuse. I chose not to investigate further because I assumed that Dumbledore's oversight was sufficient and that my own complicated feelings about your father made me an unreliable judge of your circumstances." The admission was clearly difficult for Snape to make, but he pressed on with the same grim determination he brought to brewing particularly challenging potions. "I failed you," Snape said simply. "As an educator, as someone who had experienced abuse myself, and as someone who owed your mother a debt that could never be fully repaid, I failed to protect you when protection was needed. I will not make such assumptions about institutional oversight again." "Professor," Harry said quietly, "you weren't responsible for what happened to me. The people responsible were the ones who hurt me, and the ones who covered it up." "Nevertheless," Snape replied, "I learned a valuable lesson about the danger of deferring moral judgment to authority figures, regardless of their reputation or stated intentions. It was a lesson that many others were learning as well, often through painful self-examination of their own choices and assumptions." The formal inquiry into Dumbledore's conduct had been triggered by a cascade of complaints filed with the Ministry's Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, though the investigation quickly expanded beyond questions of lycanthrope guardianship rights to encompass broader issues of child welfare, oversight, and administrative accountability. "The fundamental question," Director Shacklebolt explained during a public hearing that Harry attended as both witness and victim, "is whether institutional reputation should ever take precedence over individual welfare, and what safeguards need to be in place to ensure that even our most respected leaders remain accountable for their treatment of the vulnerable people under their care." The hearing itself had been both more and less difficult than Harry had anticipated. More difficult because recounting his experiences in a formal, public setting required a level of emotional control that sometimes felt almost impossible to maintain. Less difficult because the officials conducting the inquiry treated his testimony with the gravity and respect it deserved, asking thoughtful questions designed to understand rather than to discredit or dismiss. "Mr. Potter," the lead investigator had said during his testimony, "in your view, what changes would need to be made to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future?" Harry had thought carefully before answering, knowing that his words would likely influence policy decisions affecting countless other children. "Mandatory reporting," he said finally. "Anyone who works with children should be required by law to report suspected abuse, regardless of who the suspected abuser is or what institutional complications such reports might create. And there should be regular, independent oversight of children's living situations, not just medical checkups, but psychological evaluations that can't be circumvented through memory modification. And regarding memory modification, specifically, it should be illegal to perform non-consensual memory modification on anyone under the age of majority, with exceptions only for genuine medical emergencies, and only with oversight from multiple independent healers, Harry said firmly. What was done to me was a form of torture disguised as therapy. No child should ever have their authentic experiences erased simply because those experiences are inconvenient for the adults responsible for their care. The recommendations that emerged from the inquiry went far beyond anything Harry had initially imagined, encompassing sweeping reforms to child protection services, mandatory training for educators in recognizing abuse, and strict limitations on memory modification that closed the loopholes that had allowed Dumbledore's actions to continue unchecked for so many years. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Harry's revelations was the way they emboldened other survivors of abuse to come forward with their own stories, creating a broader conversation about power, authority, and accountability that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of his case. Rita Skeeter's exposé, published in a special edition of the Daily Prophet that sold more copies than any issue in the newspaper's history, had been surprisingly restrained by her usual standards. Instead of sensationalizing Harry's suffering for entertainment value, she had focused on the systemic failures that had enabled his abuse and the institutional reforms that would be necessary to prevent similar cases. "The Boy Who Lived Speaks Out, a call for accountability in child protection," the headline had read, accompanied by a photograph of Harry testifying at the inquiry with an expression of calm determination that seemed to embody a new kind of heroism, not the flashy courage of defeating dark wizards, but the quieter bravery of speaking truth to power. The article had included interviews with child welfare experts from both the magical and Muggle worlds, creating a comprehensive picture of the reforms needed to protect vulnerable children from those who would exploit their powerlessness. More importantly, the article had included a sidebar encouraging other survivors of abuse to seek help, providing contact information for support services and legal resources that many readers hadn't known existed. The response had been overwhelming. Within days of the article's publication, advocacy organizations were reporting increases in contacts from people seeking help with current abuse situations or support in processing past trauma. The Wizarding World's first dedicated support group for survivors of childhood abuse had been established within a month, led by a team of healers and advocates who understood that healing required community as well as individual therapy. "Harry," Remus said one evening, as they reviewed letters from some of the survivors who had contacted Harry directly, "I hope you understand what you've accomplished. You didn't just save yourself. You've saved other people who might never have found the courage to speak out without your example." Harry studied the letters spread across the table before him. Dozens of accounts from people who had experienced various forms of abuse, manipulation, or neglect, and who credited his testimony with giving them the framework to understand their own experiences and seek appropriate help. "I'm glad," Harry said simply. "I'm glad something good came from what happened to me." "Something good?" Remus repeated gently. "Harry, you've sparked the most significant child welfare reforms in a century. You've changed how our society thinks about authority, accountability, and protection. You've given voice to people who had been silenced by shame or fear or manipulation." "I just told the truth," Harry said. "Yes," Remus agreed. "And sometimes that's the most revolutionary thing a person can do." The formal censure of Albus Dumbledore had been delivered on a cold March morning, read aloud in the great hall before the assembled school by Director Shacklebolt himself. The document was carefully worded, but uncompromising in its conclusions. Dumbledore had violated his duty of care to a student under his protection, had engaged in unauthorized and harmful medical procedures, and had prioritized institutional convenience over individual welfare in ways that constituted severe professional misconduct. The censure stopped short of removing Dumbledore from his position as headmaster, but it stripped him of several key authorities and placed him under ongoing oversight that would prevent similar abuses in the future. More importantly, it established precedents that would govern the conduct of educators and administrators for generations to come. Harry had felt strangely empty during the reading of the censure, as though the formal acknowledgement of what had been done to him was less satisfying than he'd expected. It wasn't until later, walking through the corridors of Hogwarts with Hermione and Ron, that he understood what he was feeling. "It's not really about him anymore, is it?" he said suddenly. "What do you mean?" Ron asked. "The censure, the inquiry, all of it," Harry explained. "It's not really about punishing Dumbledore for what he did to me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." "Is that disappointing?" Hermione asked gently. Harry considered the question, taking mental inventory of his emotional response to the day's events. "No," he said finally. "It's better. What happened to me was terrible, but it's over. What matters now is making sure other children don't have to go through what I went through." The policy changes that emerged from the inquiry were implemented with unprecedented speed, driven by public pressure and political momentum that made resistance virtually impossible. The Child Protection Act of 1994 established mandatory reporting requirements, independent oversight of vulnerable children's living situations, and strict limitations on memory modification that effectively eliminated the loopholes Dumbledore had exploited. More broadly, the entire incident had sparked a cultural shift in how the wizarding world thought about authority and accountability. The automatic deference to powerful figures that had characterized much of magical society was being replaced by a more thoughtful approach that prioritized evidence over reputation and individual welfare over institutional convenience. "You know what the most important change is?" McGonagall told Harry during one of their regular check-in meetings. "It's not any specific policy or regulation. It's the fact that children throughout our community now know that their voices matter, that they have the right to be heard when they're being harmed, and that there are adults who will believe them and act on their behalf." Harry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. For too long, the wizarding world had operated on the assumption that certain people were beyond question, that institutional authority automatically conferred moral legitimacy, and that individual suffering was an acceptable price for maintaining stability or pursuing abstract ideals. His willingness to challenge those assumptions had created space for others to do the same, leading to a broader transformation that extended far beyond his specific case. The first annual conference on child protection in magical communities was held that summer at the Ministry of Magic, bringing together educators, healers, legal advocates, and policymakers from across Europe to share best practices and coordinate reform efforts. Harry had been invited to deliver the keynote address, though he'd initially been reluctant to accept such a high-profile role. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak to a room full of experts," he told Remus when the invitation arrived. "You're the most qualified person in the room," Remus replied firmly. "Not because you have academic credentials or professional experience, but because you've lived through what all those experts are trying to prevent. Your perspective is the one that matters most." Harry's speech, delivered to a packed auditorium that included many of the people who had played roles in his case, was brief but powerful. "For 13 years, he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "I lived with systematic abuse that was hidden from me through magic designed to make me compliant and silent. I was told that my suffering was necessary, that it served a greater purpose, that questioning it would be selfish and dangerous. I'm here today not to relitigate the specific failures in my case, but to ask all of you to remember that behind every policy decision, every administrative choice, every institutional priority is a real person whose life will be shaped by what you decide. The children you're here to protect are not abstract concepts or strategic assets. They're individuals with the right to safety, to truth, and to voices that are heard and believed when they speak about their experiences. When you're faced with difficult decisions about competing priorities or institutional pressures, I ask you to remember that no cause, however noble, and no authority figure, however respected, is more important than the welfare of the children in your care. Thank you. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but what moved Harry most was the conversation that took place afterward, as dozens of attendees approached him to share their own commitment to ensuring that the reforms sparked by his courage would create lasting change. As the summer drew to a close, and Harry prepared to return to Hogwarts for what would be his final year, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory his life had taken since his memories had first begun to surface in that potions classroom. He had set out simply to understand what had been done to him, and to reclaim control over his own experiences. What he had accomplished was something much larger, a fundamental shift in how his society thought about power, accountability, and the treatment of its most vulnerable members. "Do you ever regret it?" Remus asked one evening, as they sat on the grounds of Hogwarts, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. "Speaking out, I mean. Dealing with all the public attention and political consequences." Harry considered the question, thinking about the difficult months of testimony and inquiry, the overwhelming response from other survivors, and the weight of knowing that his choices had influenced policies affecting thousands of children he would never meet. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. What happened to me was terrible, but if my willingness to talk about it means that other children will be better protected, then it was worth it. Even though it cost you your privacy, your ability to just be a normal teenager." "I was never going to be a normal teenager anyway," Harry said with a slight smile. "Boy who lived, remember? But at least now, when people look at me, they're seeing someone who stood up for himself, and others rather than just someone who survived because his mother died for him. And that's better? Much better," Harry said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I'm known for something I chose to do, rather than something that happened to me. That feels real, authentic, like it's actually mine." As they walked back toward the castle, Harry felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with public recognition or institutional reform. He had taken his authentic experiences, however painful, and used them to create positive change in the world. He had refused to let his suffering be meaningless by ensuring that other children would have protections he had been denied. Most importantly, he had learned that speaking truth, however difficult, was always preferable to comfortable silence. The ripple effects of his courage would continue long after the specific details of his case had faded from public memory, creating a legacy of accountability and protection that honored both his own experiences and the experiences of every child who would benefit from the changes he had helped bring about. The boy who lived had become the boy who spoke out, and in doing so, he had discovered something more valuable than fame or gratitude, the knowledge that his voice mattered, that his experiences had meaning, and that his choices could make the world better for others facing similar challenges. It was a legacy worth building a life around. Chapter 11. Healing and Growth. The Office of Mind. Healer Lydia Clearwater had become as familiar to Harry as the common room of Gryffindor Tower, though the atmosphere was entirely different from either the casual chaos of student life or the formal structure of classroom instruction. Here, surrounded by soft chairs and gentle lighting that seemed designed to encourage honesty rather than performance, Harry had learned to navigate the complex landscape of his authentic emotions without the artificial buffers that had shaped his responses for so many years. "How are you feeling about the upcoming summer?" Healer Clearwater asked during their weekly session, her voice carrying the kind of genuine curiosity that Harry had come to recognize as different from the strategic questioning he'd experienced from adults throughout his childhood. Harry considered the question carefully, taking mental inventory of his emotional response to the prospect of his first summer holiday that wouldn't involve returning to an abusive household or having his memories of that household systematically altered. Excited, he said, and was mildly surprised to discover that the word was accurate. I know that probably sounds strange, given how much I used to dread holidays, but I'm actually looking forward to having unstructured time with people who care about me. That doesn't sound strange at all, Healer Clearwater replied with a warm smile. It sounds like healthy anticipation of positive experiences. Can you tell me more about what specifically excites you? Remus and I are planning to travel, Harry said, settling more comfortably in his chair as he thought about the conversations they'd had over breakfast that morning. Nothing dramatic or exotic, just places we both want to see. Museums, historical sites, maybe some hiking in Wales, things I never got to do because I was either locked away or too emotionally numb to appreciate anything outside of basic survival. It was a conversation that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, when Harry's summers had been defined by memory modification and artificial contentment rather than genuine choice and authentic anticipation. The change represented more than just improved circumstances. It reflected a fundamental shift in Harry's relationship with his own future, from something that happened to him to something he actively participated in creating. And how does it feel to be making plans based on your own interests rather than other people's expectations? Healer Clearwater asked. Revolutionary, Harry said without hesitation. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what I want to do based on what actually appeals to me rather than what I think I'm supposed to want or what other people have decided would be good for me. The therapeutic work they'd been doing together had focused not just on processing the trauma Harry had experienced, but on helping him develop the emotional skills and self-awareness that had been systematically prevented during his childhood. Learning to identify his authentic preferences, to trust his own judgment, to form relationships based on genuine affection rather than survival necessity. I've been thinking about what I want to study after Hogwarts, Harry continued. Not what people expect me to study because I'm the boy who lived or what Dumbledore thought would be useful for fighting dark wizards, but what actually interests me. And what does interest you? Healing, Harry said, though the word felt both familiar and strange in his mouth. Not just medical healing, but the kind of work you do, helping people process difficult experiences, develop emotional resilience, understand the difference between survival responses and authentic choices. It was an ambition that had emerged gradually over the months of his own healing, as Harry recognized how profoundly different his life had become when he'd finally gained access to appropriate therapeutic support. The idea of providing similar support to other people felt both meaningful and personally fulfilling in ways that careers in aura work or professional Quidditch, the paths most often suggested for him, had never managed. That's a significant career goal, Healer Clearwater observed. What draws you to that particular field? Harry was quiet for a moment, considering how to articulate the complex motivations that had been developing alongside his emotional recovery. I know what it feels like to live with your authentic experiences hidden from you, he said finally. I know what it's like to have your emotional responses managed for other people's convenience, to be told that your suffering is necessary for abstract ideals, to be convinced that asking for help is selfish or dangerous. He paused, gathering his thoughts as he reflected on the journey from his breakdown in the potions classroom to the relative stability and happiness he'd found living with Remus. I also know what it feels like to heal from those experiences when you have genuine support and honest information about what happened to you, Harry continued. I know the difference between artificial stability and authentic resilience, between being managed and being cared for. If I can help other people make that same transition, from survival to healing to whatever comes after healing, that seems like a worthwhile way to spend my life. Healer Clearwater nodded with evident approval, though her expression remained professionally neutral. "Have you discussed this with Professor Lupin?" "We talked about it last week," Harry said, his voice warming as he thought about Remus's response to his emerging career plans. He was supportive, obviously, but he also wanted to make sure I was choosing this path because it genuinely appeals to me, rather than because I feel obligated to turn my trauma into something productive. "And how did you respond to that concern?" I told him that I've spent enough time learning to recognize the difference between obligation and authentic choice, Harry said with a slight smile. "This feels like authentic choice. It feels like something I want to do rather than something I should do." The distinction was one that had required considerable therapeutic work to establish clearly in Harry's mind. For so many years, his choices had been constrained by artificial emotional responses designed to ensure his compliance with other people's agendas. Learning to trust his own preferences, to distinguish between genuine interest and conditioned response, had been one of the more challenging aspects of his recovery. The improvement in his academic performance had been one of the most visible indicators of his emotional healing, though the change was more complex than simply achieving better marks on essays and examinations. With the anxiety and hypervigilance that had characterized his previous approach to schoolwork replaced by genuine curiosity and intrinsic motivation, Harry found himself engaging with his studies in ways that had been impossible when his energy was devoted primarily to survival and damage control. "Your defense against the dark arts essay on protective enchantments was exceptional," Professor McGonagall had told him during their most recent academic review meeting. "Not just technically proficient, but thoughtful in ways that suggest genuine engagement with the material rather than mere compliance with assignment requirements." Harry had felt a flush of pride that was entirely different from the artificial satisfaction he'd experienced during his years of memory modification. This pleasure in his own accomplishment felt real, earned through effort and understanding, rather than manufactured to ensure his continued cooperation with institutional expectations. "I think I'm finally able to learn for the sake of learning," he'd told McGonagall. "When I wasn't constantly managing trauma responses or trying to figure out what adults wanted from me, it turned out I actually enjoy academic challenges." The change had been noted by other professors as well, though it was Remus who understood most clearly what Harry's improved academic performance actually represented. "You're learning because you want to understand things," Remus had observed during one of their evening conversations. "Not because you're afraid of disappointing someone, or because you're trying to meet expectations, but because knowledge itself has become interesting to you." "It's strange," Harry had replied. "I always thought I was a mediocre student, because my marks were uneven and I had trouble concentrating during lectures. But it turns out I was a traumatized student who was doing remarkably well considering how much of my mental energy was devoted to simply surviving each day." The distinction mattered more than might have been immediately apparent. For the first time in his life, Harry was experiencing what it felt like to have his intellectual curiosity supported rather than constrained, to pursue understanding for its own sake, rather than as a means of avoiding punishment or earning approval. His relationships with Hermione and Ron had undergone a similar transformation, deepening in ways that reflected his growing capacity for authentic emotional intimacy, rather than the careful performances that had characterized so many of his previous interactions with friends. "I need to tell you something," Harry had said to them during a study session in the library that had gradually evolved into a conversation about more personal matters. "I've been thinking about how our friendship has changed since I recovered my memories, and I realize I owe you both an apology." "What for?" Ron had asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "For not trusting you enough to share what was really happening to me," Harry had said. "I know the memory modifications made it impossible for me to remember most of it, but there were always signs, always moments when I could have reached out for help if I'd believed that you would take my concerns seriously." "Harry," Hermione had said gently, "you were conditioned not to seek help. That wasn't a failure of trust. That was the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to keep you isolated. I know that intellectually, Harry had replied, but emotionally, I still feel like I robbed us of the chance to have a friendship based on complete honesty rather than careful omissions. The conversation that followed had been one of many similar discussions that had allowed their friendship to develop beyond the somewhat superficial bonds of shared adventures and mutual loyalty toward something deeper and more sustainable. I want you to know, Ron had said during that same conversation, that knowing what actually happened to you doesn't change how I feel about you as a friend. If anything, it makes me respect you more. Because I understand now how much strength it took for you to be the kind of person who cared about other people, despite having so little genuine care in your own life. And I want you to know, Hermione had added, that you never have to apologize for protecting yourself in the only ways that were available to you. We're just grateful that you're finally in a situation where you don't have to protect yourself from the people who claim to care about you. These deeper conversations had become a regular feature of their friendship, replacing the careful emotional distance Harry had maintained during his years of artificial stability with the kind of authentic vulnerability that characterized genuinely intimate relationships. More surprisingly, Harry had begun to find meaning and satisfaction in mentoring younger students who were struggling with family difficulties or trauma responses that he recognized from his own experience. It had begun informally, when he'd noticed a first-year Hufflepuff named Timothy Crow displaying behavioral patterns that seemed familiar. "Timothy," Harry had said one afternoon when he'd found the boy sitting alone in an empty classroom, staring out the window with the kind of blank expression that Harry remembered from his own worst days. "Are you all right?" Timothy had looked up with the startled wariness that came from learning not to trust adult attention, though his expression had softened slightly when he'd recognized Harry as a fellow student rather than a professor. "I'm fine," Timothy had said automatically, though everything about his posture and tone suggested otherwise. "I used to say that too," Harry had replied, settling into the chair across from Timothy, with the kind of casual friendliness that didn't feel threatening. "Usually when I was anything but fine." The conversation that followed had been careful and gentle, with Harry sharing enough of his own experience to demonstrate understanding without overwhelming Timothy with details that might be too much for an 11-year-old to process. What had emerged was that Timothy was experiencing emotional abuse from an older brother who resented his magical abilities, coupled with parents who dismissed the problem as normal sibling rivalry, rather than recognizing it as a pattern that was affecting Timothy's ability to function at school. "The thing is," Harry had told Timothy, "you don't have to handle this alone. There are adults here who understand the difference between normal family conflict and actual abuse, and who are trained to help students in your situation." The mentoring relationship that developed from that initial conversation had been deeply rewarding for both of them. Timothy gained access to appropriate support and advocacy that allowed him to address his family situation constructively, while Harry discovered that he had both the insight and the emotional skills necessary to help other young people navigate similar challenges. "You're good at this," Professor McGonagall had told Harry after Timothy's situation had been resolved through appropriate interventions with his family. "You have a natural ability to establish trust with students who are struggling, and you understand the importance of connecting them with adult support rather than trying to solve their problems yourself. I think it's because I know what it feels like to struggle alone," Harry had replied, "and I know what it feels like to finally have appropriate help. I can't solve other people's problems, but I can help them understand that their problems are worth solving, and that there are people who can help them do it." The mentoring work had led to Harry being formally trained as a peer counselor, a role that allowed him to provide support to other students while working under the supervision of qualified adults who could ensure that both he and the students he helped remained safe and appropriately supported. Perhaps the most significant change in Harry's life, however, was the way his relationship with Remus had evolved into something that felt genuinely familial rather than merely protective. The careful boundaries that had characterized their early interactions, the politeness of a traumatized child toward a well-meaning adult, had given way to the kind of comfortable intimacy that existed between people who knew they could trust each other completely. "I've been thinking about taking the apparition test this summer," Harry mentioned one evening as they worked together in Remus's kitchen, preparing dinner with the kind of easy collaboration that had developed over months of shared domestic routines. "That's a significant step," Remus replied, though his tone carried approval rather than concern. "Are you feeling ready for that level of independence?" "I think so," Harry said, considering the question seriously, rather than responding with automatic enthusiasm or reflexive anxiety. "I know I'm not ready for complete independence. I still need the stability and support I get from living with you. But I think I'm ready for the kind of independence that comes with being able to get myself places without having to rely on other people's schedules or transportation." "That seems like a healthy distinction," Remus agreed. "Growing independence within a secure relationship rather than independence as escape from an uncomfortable situation." It was exactly the kind of conversation that characterized their relationship: honest, supportive, focused on Harry's authentic development rather than external expectations or arbitrary timelines. "There's something else I've been thinking about," Harry said, setting down his knife as he finished chopping vegetables for their stew. "I know you took guardianship of me because I needed protection and support, but I want you to know that I hope our relationship continues after I'm of age." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I hope you'll still want to be my family, even when I don't legally need a guardian anymore," Harry clarified. "Not because of obligation or duty, but because we choose to maintain a relationship that's important to both of us." Remus was quiet for a moment, though his expression suggested he was moved rather than troubled by Harry's words. "Harry," he said finally, "you've been the best thing that's happened to me in years. Not because I needed someone to protect, but because I needed someone to love. You've given me the chance to be the kind of father figure I always hoped I could be, and you've shown me what it feels like to have genuine family bonds rather than just shared history or obligation. So that's a yes to staying family after I turn 17? "That's a definitive yes," Remus said with a smile. "For as long as you want me around." The conversation represented something Harry had never experienced before: the certainty that his family relationships were based on mutual affection and choice rather than legal obligation or strategic necessity. It was a foundation that made other forms of emotional risk feel possible rather than dangerous, which was how Harry found himself, for the first time in his life, developing romantic feelings for someone without the experience being tainted by trauma responses or artificial emotional management. Cho Chang had been a friend for months before Harry began to recognize that his feelings for her were developing beyond friendship, and even then, the realization came gradually rather than as a sudden discovery or dramatic revelation. "I think I might fancy Cho," Harry had told Hermione one afternoon as they walked around the lake, enjoying the kind of late spring weather that made outdoor conversations particularly appealing. "Finally," Hermione had said with a grin. "Ron and I have been waiting for you to notice." "Was it that obvious?" "Only to people who know you well," Hermione had replied diplomatically. "You've been finding excuses to spend time with her for weeks, and you get this particular expression whenever she laughs at something you've said." "What kind of expression?" "The expression of someone who's pleased that he's made someone he cares about happy," Hermione had explained. "It's different from your normal pleased expression because it's specifically about her reaction rather than about the conversation generally." Harry had absorbed this information with the kind of amused embarrassment that came from realizing his feelings had been more transparent than he'd intended. "Do you think she might feel the same way?" "I think," Hermione had said carefully, "that you should probably ask her yourself. But based on the amount of time she spends looking for opportunities to talk with you, I'd say your chances are quite good. The conversation with Cho, when it finally occurred, was refreshingly straightforward and free from the dramatic complications that seemed to characterize most teenage romantic relationships in the stories Harry had read. "Cho," Harry had said one evening, when they'd found themselves alone in the common room after most other students had retired for the night. "I was wondering if you'd like to go to Hogsmeade with me this weekend. Not as friends, but as more than friends." "I was wondering when you were going to ask," Cho had replied with a smile that made Harry's chest feel warm in entirely unfamiliar ways. "Yes, I'd like that very much." "Really?" "Really," Cho had confirmed. "I've been hoping you'd notice that I enjoy spending time with you for reasons that go beyond our shared interest in defense against the dark arts." The relationship that developed from that initial conversation was characterized by the same honest communication and mutual respect that Harry had learned to value in his friendship with Hermione and Ron. Instead of the possessive intensity or emotional manipulation that characterized many teenage relationships, Harry and Cho developed something based on genuine affection, shared interests, and the kind of emotional intimacy that was possible when both people involved had healthy boundaries and authentic self-awareness. "It's nice," Harry had told Remus when asked about his new relationship. "Not dramatic or overwhelming, just nice. She makes me happy, and I think I make her happy, and we're both comfortable with the pace at which things are developing." "That sounds remarkably healthy for a first relationship," Remus had observed with evident approval. "I think it helps that I'm finally in a place where I can trust my own emotions," Harry had replied. "I'm not trying to figure out what I'm supposed to feel or what other people expect from me. I can just enjoy being with someone who cares about me and see where it goes from there." The culmination of all these changes, the therapeutic progress, the academic improvement, the deepened friendships, the natural family relationship with Remus, the emerging romantic relationship with Cho, came together on Harry's 14th birthday, which was celebrated with the kind of genuine joy and attention to his preferences that he'd never experienced before. Instead of the perfunctory celebrations or complete ignorance that had characterized his previous birthdays, this one had been planned specifically around things that would make Harry happy rather than things that others thought he should appreciate. The day began with breakfast in bed, not because Harry was ill or incapacitated, but because Remus had wanted to spoil him in the kind of uncomplicated way that loving family members spoiled each other on special occasions. "Happy birthday," Remus said, settling on the edge of Harry's bed with a tray containing all of Harry's favorite foods and a small wrapped package that immediately caught his attention. "What's this?" Harry asked, reaching for the gift with the kind of eager curiosity that he'd learned to trust rather than suppress. "Something I thought you might appreciate," Remus said. "Open it and see." The package contained a leather-bound journal, similar to the photograph album Remus had given him for Christmas, but designed for writing rather than pictures. "I thought you might want to document this year," Remus explained. "Not because anyone else needs to know what you're thinking or feeling, but because you deserve to have a record of your own thoughts and experiences that belongs entirely to you." Harry turned the journal over in his hands, understanding immediately why the gift was significant. For so many years, his thoughts and feelings had been subject to external monitoring and modification. The idea of having a completely private space for his authentic reflections felt both revolutionary and deeply meaningful. "Thank you," Harry said, and the words carried the weight of everything the gift represented: trust, respect for his privacy, and the acknowledgement that his inner life was valuable enough to preserve. The rest of the day had been filled with activities chosen specifically for Harry's enjoyment, rather than for their educational value or symbolic significance. A picnic with his friends by the lake, an afternoon flying session that focused on the simple pleasure of being airborne rather than competitive achievement, and an evening celebration in Remus's quarters with a small group of people who cared about Harry's happiness more than his famous status. "This is what birthdays should feel like," Harry had said, as the day wound down, and he found himself sitting by the fire with Remus, Hermione, Ron, and Cho, surrounded by the comfortable conversation and genuine affection that had been so absent from his previous experience of special occasions. "What do they feel like?" Cho had asked gently. "Like being loved," Harry had said without hesitation. "Like being valued for who I am rather than what I've accomplished or what people expect me to become. Like having my happiness matter to people just because it's my happiness." It was a realization that encompassed everything he'd learned about healing, about authentic relationships, and about his own worth as a person rather than a symbol. For 14 years, Harry Potter had been shaped by other people's interpretations of what he needed, what he could handle, and what he was capable of becoming. Now, surrounded by people who loved him for who he actually was, and supported by therapeutic and family structures that prioritized his authentic well-being, he was finally discovering what it felt like to live according to his own values and desires. "What do you think you'll write in your journal first?" Remus asked, as the evening celebration began to wind down. Harry considered the question, thinking about all the experiences and realizations that had brought him to this point of genuine contentment and authentic self-awareness. "I think," he said finally, "I'll write about what it feels like to be happy. Really, genuinely happy. Not because someone has modified my emotions or convinced me that I should be grateful for inadequate care, but because I'm surrounded by people who love me, and I'm finally free to become whoever I actually am underneath all the expectations and modifications and strategic considerations." "And who do you think that is?" Hermione asked with a warm smile. "I don't know yet," Harry admitted, "but for the first time in my life, I'm excited to find out." As his friends gradually departed and the castle settled into its nighttime rhythm, Harry found himself looking forward to the future with a sense of anticipation that was entirely free from anxiety or artificial contentment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever choices he would need to make about his education and career and relationships, he would face them with the support of people who genuinely cared about his well-being and with the emotional skills necessary to make authentic decisions rather than performing responses that others expected from him. The boy who lived had become simply Harry, a young man with friends and family and interests and dreams that belonged entirely to him. It was a transformation that had taken months of therapeutic work, careful relationship building, and the gradual development of trust in his own perceptions and preferences. But it was a transformation that felt complete in all the ways that mattered most. He was loved, he was safe, and he was free to become whoever he chose to be, rather than whoever others needed him to be. For the first time in his life, that felt like enough, and like everything. Chapter 12. A New Beginning. The end of term at Hogwarts had always carried a bittersweet quality for Harry Potter, the pleasure of completing another year of education shadowed by the dread of returning to Privet Drive and whatever fresh horrors awaited him there. But as he packed his belongings in Remus's quarters on this June morning, watching sunlight stream through windows that overlooked grounds where he'd learned what it felt like to be genuinely protected, Harry found himself experiencing something entirely foreign. Excitement about summer holidays. "Are you sure you have everything?" Remus asked from the doorway, though his voice carried amusement rather than genuine concern. They'd been packing together for days, and Harry's methodical approach to organizing his possessions reflected the same careful attention to detail that characterized everything in his life now that he was making choices based on authentic preferences rather than survival necessity. "Everything that matters," Harry replied, settling his father's invisibility cloak into the trunk with the reverent care he gave to all the artifacts that connected him to parents he'd never known, but whose love had shaped the protection that kept him alive. "Though I suspect I'll miss this place more than I expected to. It was true, though the missing would be entirely different from the desperate homesickness that had characterized his previous departures from Hogwarts. This would be the natural sadness of leaving a place where he'd been happy, where he'd learned to trust his own emotions and form authentic relationships, where he'd discovered what it felt like to be valued for who he was, rather than what he represented. "Hogwarts will still be here when we return," Remus said gently. "And so will the people who care about you." "I know," Harry said, and the certainty in his voice reflected months of learning that love didn't disappear during temporary separations, that security wasn't something that could be revoked without warning, that the relationships he'd built were based on genuine affection rather than convenience or obligation. The morning's final task was one that Harry had requested specifically, though it had taken considerable courage to propose. He wanted to address the younger students about recognizing abuse and seeking appropriate help. Professor McGonagall had arranged for him to speak to first- and second-year students during their final assembly, and Harry had spent weeks preparing remarks that would be both honest about difficult realities and hopeful about the possibility of healing when appropriate support was available. "Remember," Remus said as they walked toward the Great Hall together, "you're not responsible for solving every problem or helping every student who might be struggling. Your role is simply to share information that might be useful and to let them know that help is available when they need it." "I remember," Harry replied, though he could feel nervous energy building in his chest as they approached the hall, where nearly 100 young students were gathered to hear him speak. "I just hope I can say something that matters to the students who need to hear it most." The Great Hall had been rearranged for the occasion, with the younger students seated at tables that formed a rough semicircle around a small podium that had been placed near the head table. Harry could see faces he recognized from corridors and common rooms, along with many he didn't know personally, but who knew him by reputation as the boy who lived, an identity that felt increasingly distant from the person he'd become through months of healing and authentic growth. "Good morning," Harry began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Most of you know me as Harry Potter, and you probably know some version of my story about surviving dark magic and fighting in wars against evil wizards." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces that regarded him with the mixture of curiosity and hero worship that he'd learned to navigate without letting it define his self-worth. "But today, I want to talk to you about a different part of my story, one that doesn't get told as often because it's not as exciting as dragon battles or Quidditch victories, but which might be more important for some of you to hear." Harry took a breath, grounding himself in the certainty that what he was about to share could genuinely help students who were experiencing situations similar to what he'd endured. "I spent my childhood being systematically abused by the relatives who were supposed to care for me," he said simply. "Physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, all of it was real, and all of it was hidden from the adults at Hogwarts through magic that made me forget most of what had happened." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft sound of shifting robes as students leaned forward to listen more carefully. "I'm telling you this not because I want sympathy or attention, but because I want you to understand that if something similar is happening to you, it's not your fault. It's not something you have to handle alone. And there are adults here who are trained to help you in ways that prioritize your safety and well-being." Harry continued for another 10 minutes, sharing information about recognizing different forms of abuse, understanding that family problems weren't normal when they involved deliberate harm, and knowing how to seek help from trusted adults when home situations became unsafe or inappropriate. "The most important thing I want you to remember," he concluded, "is that you deserve to be treated with kindness and respect by the adults in your life. If that's not happening, it's not because you've done something wrong or because you're not worth protecting. It's because the adults in your situation are failing to meet their responsibilities, and there are other adults who can help ensure you get the care you deserve." The questions that followed were thoughtful and sometimes heartbreaking, students asking about situations that clearly reflected their own experiences with family difficulties, emotional manipulation, or worse. Harry answered each question as honestly as he could, while encouraging students with serious concerns to speak privately with Professor McGonagall or other trusted faculty members. When the session finally ended, Harry felt emotionally drained but deeply satisfied. Several students had approached him afterward to say that his words had helped them understand their own situations more clearly, and 3 had asked Professor McGonagall for private meetings to discuss family concerns that they'd previously been afraid to voice. "You did well," Professor McGonagall told Harry as the last students filed out of the Great Hall. "Speaking about personal trauma in service of helping others requires considerable courage, and you handled both the information sharing and the questions with exactly the right balance of honesty and appropriate boundaries." "Thank you," Harry said, meaning it deeply. "I hope it makes a difference for the students who needed to hear it." "It already has," McGonagall replied firmly. "And it will continue to make a difference for years to come, as those students remember that they have options and support when they face difficult situations." That afternoon, Harry found himself in one of his favorite spots at Hogwarts, a quiet corner of the grounds near the lake, where he'd had some of his most important conversations with Remus over the past year. They sat together on a blanket Remus had conjured, sharing sandwiches and butterbeer while watching the giant squid's tentacles break the surface of the water in lazy, hypnotic patterns. "I've been thinking about what I want to do this summer," Harry said, settling more comfortably against Remus's shoulder in the kind of casual physical affection that had become natural between them. "Beyond the traveling and the therapy sessions and all the practical stuff we've already planned." "What kind of things?" Remus asked gently. "I want to learn to cook properly," Harry said, surprising himself with the specificity of the desire. "Not just basic survival cooking, but the kind of cooking that's about creating something beautiful and nourishing for people you care about. I want to learn to garden. Maybe start growing herbs or vegetables that we can use for meals together." He paused, organizing his thoughts as he considered the emerging picture of the kind of life he wanted to build for himself. "I want to read books that I choose because they interest me, not because they're assigned, or because they might be strategically useful. I want to write in that journal you gave me, not because anyone will ever read it, but because I want to have a record of my thoughts and feelings that belongs entirely to me." "Those all sound like wonderful goals," Remus said warmly. "Anything else?" "I want to learn how to be someone who's genuinely happy more often than not," Harry said quietly. "Not the artificial contentment that was manufactured for me for so many years, but real happiness based on authentic experiences and relationships." "And how do you think you'll go about learning that?" Harry was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to all the important decisions in his life, now that he was free to make choices based on his own judgment, rather than external expectations. "I think," he said finally, "it starts with continuing to surround myself with people who love me for who I actually am. People like you, and Hermione and Ron, and Cho, and Professor McGonagall, and even Professor Snape in his own complicated way." "That's an excellent foundation," Remus agreed. "And I think it involves continuing to choose experiences that feel meaningful rather than obligatory," Harry continued. "Studying things that genuinely interest me, pursuing relationships that feel authentic, making decisions based on what I actually want, rather than what I think I should want." "Those both sound like healthy approaches to building a life that feels genuinely satisfying." Harry nodded, feeling the rightness of the plans they were making settle into his bones like certainty. For so many years, his future had been shaped by other people's interpretations of what was necessary or desirable for him. Now, finally, he was creating plans based on his own values and preferences, with the support of people who wanted him to flourish rather than simply survive. That evening, alone in his room while Remus finished his own packing, Harry pulled out the leather-bound journal that had become one of his most treasured possessions and began writing a letter he'd been composing in his mind for weeks. Dear Harry, age 11, I know you're scared right now. I know you're confused about why the adults at Hogwarts keep sending you back to people who hurt you, why your memories of what happened during the summer feel strange and disconnected, why you can never quite remember details about your home life that seem important. I want you to know that what's happening to you isn't your fault. The people who hurt you are responsible for their choices to cause harm, and the people who hide that harm are responsible for their choices to prioritize convenience over your well-being. You are not responsible for being hurt, and you are not responsible for other people's failures to protect you appropriately. I also want you to know that it gets better. Not immediately, and not without considerable effort and some very difficult conversations, but it does get better. You will find adults who see your suffering and choose to help rather than hide it. You will learn the difference between protection and control, between love and management, between authentic emotions and artificial contentment. You will discover that you are worthy of love that doesn't require you to perform or pretend or minimize your own experiences. You will learn to trust your own perceptions and make choices based on what you actually want, rather than what other people think you should want. Most importantly, you will learn that your voice matters. When you're ready to speak about what has been done to you, there will be people who listen and believe and act on your behalf. Your truth has power, and sharing it will not only help you heal but will help other children who are experiencing similar harm. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more loved than you've been allowed to understand. Hold on to that knowledge, even when everything else feels uncertain. With love and hope for your future, Harry, age 14. Writing the letter felt like closing a circle that had been open since his memories first began to surface in that potions classroom nearly a year earlier. The boy who had written those words was not the same person who had collapsed in agony when authentic experiences began breaking through artificial barriers, but he was connected to that earlier version of himself through compassion rather than shame, understanding rather than regret. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to Remus's quarters, as friends and faculty members stopped by to offer farewell wishes and promises of continued connection over the summer holidays. Hermione arrived first, carrying a stack of books she thought Harry might enjoy during his travels and a carefully written list of all the ways they could stay in contact during their time apart. I know we've been through this already, she said, settling into one of the chairs beside Harry's nearly packed trunk. But I want to make sure you understand that our friendship doesn't depend on your continued presence at Hogwarts or your ability to entertain us with dramatic adventures. I know, Harry said, touched by her concern, despite the fact that they'd had similar conversations multiple times over the past month. I mean that we care about you as Harry, the person who worries about house elves and helps first years find their classrooms and shares his sweets even when he doesn't have many, not as the boy who lived or the person who survived terrible things or any other identity that might feel more dramatic. I know that too, Harry said gently. Hermione, you've shown me what real friendship looks like. You've taught me that people can care about each other without expecting anything in return, except the pleasure of each other's company. Ron arrived shortly after Hermione, bringing with him a Weasley family tradition, a hand-knitted sweater from Mrs. Weasley that proclaimed Harry's status as an honorary member of their chaotic, loving family. Mum says you're always welcome at the Burrow, Ron said, settling cross-legged on the floor with the casual comfort that characterized all his interactions with Harry. Not for holidays or special occasions, but any time you want company or home cooking, or people who think you're brilliant just for being yourself. Tell her thank you, Harry said, running his fingers over the soft wool of the sweater that had been made specifically for him, in colors chosen to complement his complexion rather than to make a general statement about Gryffindor loyalty. Also, Ron continued with a grin, I'm supposed to tell you that Fred and George have been working on some new products that they want to test on willing volunteers this summer, and they specifically requested your participation because they value your judgment about whether their pranks are funny or just mean. That's either a compliment or a terrifying responsibility, Harry replied with a laugh. Probably both, Ron agreed cheerfully. Professor McGonagall's visit was more formal, but no less meaningful, carrying with it the weight of institutional recognition that Harry's courage and growth represented more than personal healing. Mr. Potter, she said, settling into the chair across from him with the dignified grace that had characterized all their interactions, I wanted to express my pride in the young man you've become over this past year. Thank you, Professor. I don't mean pride in your academic improvement, though that has been remarkable, McGonagall continued. I mean pride in your moral courage, your willingness to speak truth to power, your commitment to helping other vulnerable students, and your refusal to allow your suffering to be minimized or dismissed. She paused, her expression growing more serious as she continued. In my 30 years of teaching, I have rarely seen a student demonstrate the kind of ethical clarity and personal strength you've shown in challenging systems and authorities that were failing in their duty to protect you. You've changed this institution for the better, Mr. Potter, and you've changed the broader wizarding world's understanding of child welfare and adult responsibility. I just told the truth, Harry said quietly. Yes, McGonagall agreed. And sometimes that's the most revolutionary thing a person can do. Before she left, McGonagall presented Harry with a letter of recommendation for his future studies in mind healing, a document that praised not only his academic abilities, but his personal insight into trauma recovery and his demonstrated commitment to helping others navigate similar challenges. When you're ready to apply for advanced training, she said, this letter will help ensure that admissions committees understand not only your qualifications, but your genuine calling to this field of work. The most emotionally challenging visit of the day came from Professor Snape, who arrived at precisely the time he'd indicated in his formal note requesting a brief audience with Harry before the start of summer holidays. Potter, Snape said, standing awkwardly in the doorway of Remus's quarters, as though uncertain whether he should enter or deliver his message from a safe distance. Professor Snape, Harry replied, gesturing toward an empty chair with the kind of polite hospitality that Remus had taught him was appropriate for any guest, regardless of their history together. Snape entered, but remained standing, his usual black robes making him appear particularly severe against the warm, comfortable atmosphere of Remus's office. I came to acknowledge that my treatment of you over the past 3 years has been inappropriate, Snape said, his voice carrying the stiff quality of someone delivering words that had been carefully prepared but were still difficult to speak. You don't need to apologize, Harry began, but Snape cut him off with a sharp gesture. I do need to apologize, Snape corrected. My hostility toward you was based on my unresolved feelings about your father, and I allowed those feelings to interfere with my professional responsibilities toward a student who was already suffering considerable trauma. He paused, his expression growing more complex as he continued. Your mother would have been ashamed of my behavior, Snape said quietly. She believed that children deserved protection and support from the adults in their lives, regardless of personal grievances or historical conflicts. I failed to honor that belief in my treatment of you. Professor, Harry said gently, I understand that seeing me must be complicated for you. I look like my father, but I'm also Lily's son, and you cared about her very much. Your capacity for understanding exceeds what you should reasonably be expected to offer, Snape replied, with something that might have been self-recrimination. Nevertheless, I want you to know that your courage in speaking about your experiences has reminded me of principles I had allowed myself to forget." Before he left, Snape did something entirely unprecedented. He offered Harry a small, leather-bound book of advanced potions theory, along with a note explaining that it had belonged to Lily Potter during her final year at Hogwarts. "She would have wanted you to have it," Snape said simply, "and she would have been proud of the person you've become, despite the failures of the adults who were supposed to protect you." The final preparation for leaving Hogwarts was one that Harry had specifically requested, a visit to his parents' graves with Remus, where he could finally grieve authentically for people he'd never known, but whose love had shaped everything important in his life. They apparated to Godric's Hollow on a warm June afternoon, arriving at the small cemetery where James and Lily Potter had been buried nearly 14 years earlier. Harry had never seen their graves before. During his years of memory modification, he'd been discouraged from expressing interest in visiting sites that might trigger authentic emotional responses about his loss. Now, standing before the simple headstone that bore his parents' names and the inscription, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death," Harry felt the full weight of grief that had been denied to him for so many years. "I never got to mourn them properly," he said to Remus, as tears began to fall freely down his face. "I was told that being sad about their death was dwelling on the past, that I should be grateful for their sacrifice rather than mourning what I'd lost." "Grief and gratitude aren't mutually exclusive," Remus said gently, placing a comforting hand on Harry's shoulder. "You can be grateful for their love and sacrifice, while also mourning the relationship you never got to have with them." Harry knelt beside the grave, placing the flowers they'd brought, lilies for his mother, stag's horn fern for his father, with careful reverence. "I wish I could have known you," he said softly, speaking to the parents who existed now only in memories shared by people like Remus and in the protection that had kept him alive through his darkest years. "I wish I could tell you about the person I'm becoming, about the people who've helped me heal, about the life I'm building based on the values I think you would have wanted me to have." He paused, wiping tears from his cheeks as he continued. "I hope you would be proud of the choices I've made, the way I've tried to use my experiences to help other people, the way I've refused to let what happened to me make me bitter or cruel." "They would be proud," Remus said with absolute certainty. "They would be proud of your courage, your compassion, and your refusal to allow suffering to define your character." Harry spent nearly an hour at the graveside, sharing stories about his healing process, his relationships, his plans for the future, and his commitment to creating a life that honored both his authentic self and the legacy of love his parents had left behind. When they finally prepared to leave, Harry felt lighter than he had in months, not because the grief had disappeared, but because he'd finally been allowed to experience and express it without artificial barriers or external management. "Thank you," he said to Remus as they walked back toward the apparition point, "for bringing me here, for letting me grieve properly, for helping me understand that mourning my parents doesn't make me ungrateful for the people who love me now." "Thank you," Remus replied, "for trusting me enough to share something so important with me." That evening, as they finished the final preparations for leaving Hogwarts the next morning, Harry found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him from a traumatized, artificially compliant victim to someone with genuine autonomy over his own life and relationships. "Remus," he said, as they settled by the fire for their last evening in the quarters that had become the first real home Harry had ever known, "what's the difference between being protected and being controlled?" Remus considered the question with the thoughtful attention he brought to all of Harry's inquiries about emotional health and relationship dynamics. "Protection seeks to keep you safe while preserving your agency and decision-making capacity," he said finally. "Control seeks to manage your choices and responses to serve someone else's interests or comfort. And how do you tell the difference when you're the person being protected or controlled? Protection involves you in decisions about your own safety and well-being, Remus explained. Control makes decisions for you without your input or consent. Protection helps you develop skills and judgment that will keep you safe in the long term. Control keeps you dependent on external management rather than helping you build authentic resilience. Harry nodded, understanding exactly why the distinction mattered so much for everything he'd experienced over the past year. What I had with the Dursleys wasn't protection, even though Dumbledore called it that, Harry said. It was abandonment disguised as necessary sacrifice. And what I had with Dumbledore wasn't guidance, even though he presented it that way. It was manipulation, designed to keep me useful rather than helping me become whole. Exactly, Remus agreed. Protection and guidance that genuinely serve your interests feel different from management and control, even when the people providing them claim to have your best interests at heart. And what I have with you is actual protection, Harry said with growing confidence, because you help me make decisions rather than making them for me, because you support my authentic development rather than trying to shape me into what you think I should become. That's my intention, Remus said warmly. And if I ever fail to live up to that standard, I trust you to tell me so. I will, Harry promised, understanding that this commitment to honesty and accountability was what made their relationship genuinely safe rather than simply comfortable. The final morning at Hogwarts arrived with the kind of golden sunlight that made leaving feel both melancholy and hopeful. Harry had said his goodbyes to friends and faculty the previous day, leaving this morning free for the quiet ritual of departure that would carry him toward his first summer of genuine freedom and authentic family connection. "Ready?" Remus asked, shouldering his own travel bag as they prepared to leave the quarters that had been Harry's sanctuary during his healing process. "Ready," Harry said, though he paused at the threshold to look back at the room where he'd learned what it felt like to be truly safe, authentically loved, and completely valued for who he was, rather than what he represented. "Thank you," he said to the empty room, speaking to the space itself but also to the experiences it had contained, the conversations that had taken place within its walls, the gradual transformation that had unfolded over months of careful healing and relationship building. They walked through the corridors of Hogwarts together, past portraits and tapestries that had witnessed Harry's journey from a confused, traumatized boy to someone with clear moral convictions and authentic emotional connections. Past classrooms where he'd learned not just academic subjects, but the difference between performing for approval and learning for understanding. Past the Great Hall, where he'd spoken to younger students about recognizing abuse and seeking appropriate help. "Will you miss it?" Remus asked, as they emerged into the summer morning that would carry them toward whatever came next. "I'll miss the people," Harry said, considering the question seriously. "I'll miss having daily access to Hermione and Ron and Professor McGonagall, and even some of the younger students I've been mentoring. But I won't miss the institution, because the institution was part of what allowed me to be hurt for so long without appropriate intervention." "That's a healthy distinction," Remus observed. "I've learned to make a lot of healthy distinctions this year," Harry replied with a smile that carried genuine satisfaction rather than artificial contentment. As they reached the gates of Hogwarts and prepared to apparate to the train station where they would begin their summer journey together, Harry felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion that came from finishing tasks or meeting obligations, but the completion that came from becoming authentically himself after years of being shaped by other people's expectations and manipulations. "Remus," he said, as they paused at the boundary between Hogwarts and the wider world, "thank you for giving me the first real home I've ever had." "Thank you," Remus replied, "for giving me the first real family I've ever had." They disapparated together toward whatever adventures and challenges the summer would bring, but for the first time in his life, Harry was facing an uncertain future with genuine excitement rather than anxiety. He had people who loved him unconditionally, therapeutic support for continuing his healing process, legal protection from those who had hurt him, and most importantly, the knowledge that he was valued for who he actually was, rather than who others needed him to be. The boy who lived had finally become simply Harry, a young man with friends and family, and dreams and plans that belonged entirely to him. It was a transformation that had required tremendous courage, considerable support, and the willingness to choose difficult truths over comfortable lies. But it was a transformation that had given him something more valuable than fame or gratitude or even safety. It had given him himself, authentic, unmodified, freely choosing, genuinely loved, for the first time in his life that felt like everything he needed and exactly what he deserved. As the landscape of his childhood disappeared behind them and the promise of summer adventures stretched ahead, Harry Potter was finally, authentically, completely free. And he had never been happier to be exactly who he was.